Elad Gil, welcome to Tomorrow Talk. I am so excited and honored to have you on the show today. Thank you for being here.
Oh, thanks for including me.
When it comes to technology, I feel like you have seen and done it all. You worked at Google and helped start their mobile team. You co-founded Mixer Labs, which was acquired by Twitter. You are vice president at Twitter. You co-founded Color Health. You have invested or advised companies like Airbnb, Airtable, Coinbase, Deal, Figma, Flexport. The list really goes on. A moment like right now, where there's both a market downturn and a technology shift in AI, it feels especially relevant. Like, how do you maintain longevity in a career throughout different cycles and waves?
Yeah, I think longevity is a really interesting question, and I feel like people get longevity in one of three ways. One is they build a platform, and then that platform just continues to be important for a long period of time. And so that would be you start Google or something really big, or on the venture side you start Sequoia or Andreessen Horowitz or something else, and then you have that sort of ongoing platform to be part of, and that sort of carries you forward because the platforms have their own momentum. The second is you just kind of move from one interesting thing to the next, and sometimes you morph the nature of what your career is. And I think, for example, Naval Ravikant has done a really nice job of that, where he started companies in the 90s, and then in the 2000s he pioneered new forms of investing, and then he started AngelList, and then he got into crypto. And so, he's very early to a variety of different waves. And I think there's a handful of people who do that. I think often those people are driven in some sense by interestingness. They kind of follow what's interesting to them, and they tend to be technology forward. They actually care about technology, um, which is very different from people who care about power or who care about money or who care about very specific things that I think, either they attain it and then they stop, or they attain it and they kind of, in some cases, become quite unhappy because they've like met their life goal, or
Yeah.
whatever the thing is that they've sort of been trying for. And so I think the people that tend to have a lot of longevity in tech just love tech, or they love startups, or they love some aspect of it, and so that creates a form of reinvention. And then I think the
I
last thing is just the network.
so I'd like to double click on sort of the networks and the power of peer groups. I think in my few years so far in the space, I can really see it in people that were like 7 years above me, the way they've like really grown together, founders and investors. What's your advice for people to develop those type of really strong peer groups and cohorts?
Yeah, I think it's maybe three things. One is be in one of the main tech hubs. And in the US, at least, that's mainly the Bay Area and then to some extent New York. If you're working in like Aeroastro, maybe it's LA. But in general, I think there are very few places that really represent technology at scale. And I think that on average, really good people move to those hubs. And that doesn't mean there aren't great people in other places. It just means you have a high density of people. Second is if you join the right set of companies, you naturally form those hubs because there's a handful of companies in any given period, and to the point made earlier, they turn over every 5 to 7 years. Um, that are sort of the aspirational companies that all the great people go to, and the people who are there end up helping each other throughout the rest of their careers. So for me, that was Google and then Twitter, where a lot of the people in the Google cohort, I was part of either went and started companies, Pinterest and Instagram and a variety of things like that, or they ended up being COOs at all the major companies. The COO of Stripe was out of Google, the COO of Gusto, the COO of Dropbox, the COO of sort of the next wave of companies all came out of the same place. And so I think it's kind of like choose where you go wisely, and it doesn't matter what role it is or how much you get paid. Just go to the right company with the right set of people building against something that's
Yeah.
working really well.
Who is an example of one person or several people that have kind of been that to you? Like you've had these parallel careers where you've collaborated throughout.
Geez. There's a handful of people, and I think there's people I'm still collaborating with that maybe you start working with them 10 years ago and then you don't do anything for 5 years and suddenly you start working together again. And so I think there's this sort of long-term thinking that a lot of people lack. And I feel like the most just blatantly transactional people kind of tend to burn out of Silicon Valley or out of tech more generally because people remember, how people act. And you see people act badly and do well, but on average, most of the people who do well over a long period of time tend to be good actors in the ecosystem.
I was once reading this paper about like why Silicon Valley became the hub instead of like Boston, like other cities that had a lot of sort of fundamental pillars that were similar, like intellectual power and all these things. And one thing that was cited is like early days was incredibly collaborative in Silicon Valley in a way that New York wasn't, Boston wasn't. And thinking about these sort of cohort shifts and how things move around in the ecosystem, like what do you think Silicon Valley values most? In the sense that I don't necessarily think it's just like money or capital.
Yeah, I think it comes and goes. I think there's a common thread of people who are just techno optimists and view technology in and of itself as something that could be a real public good that a lot of people can benefit from. And if you look at the history of the last few centuries, technology has pulled hundreds of millions or billions of people out of poverty. It's helped deal with diseases. It's helped with education. It's helped with all sorts of aspects that people kind of forget for some reason. Um, and it's actually kind of interesting if you actually look at things like our world of data, survey data around where are the most optimistic people in the world, it's often at the poorest countries in terms of the people who are most optimistic about the future. And the people who are most pessimistic about the future are people in the US and in Western Europe and sort of the countries that have done best or who are sort of that high mark. And so, um,
Why do you think that is? Do you think it's because like people sort of lack context of how good they have it, or they just have the freedom to like be to think about the problems?
yeah, I think it's both. I think people completely lack context, right? If you see your neighbors are in destitute poverty and you see somebody die of starvation, you may have a very different perspective in terms of whether somebody being mean to you on social media really matters that much. So I think part of it is perspective, and then I think there's this notion in the psychology literature known as hedonic adaptation, which is you keep resetting your happiness baseline sequentially, and so you hit some moment of accomplishment and you reset what accomplishment means or what your peer set is or whatever, and suddenly you're unhappy again. And so if you read the literature on it, there's like four or five things that you should do to sort of get off that hedonic treadmill. And it's things like value experiences over physical goods.
Mm.
It's have a handful of meaningful relationships. It's get sleep and exercise. It's don't commute too far. And it kind of consistently shows up in terms of the things that correlated with happiness. It may not be causative, but it most likely is. And so there's like a handful of things that you could potentially do to be happy. And I think in the richest parts of the world, with some of the people who've done best, or just people in general, there's this lack of sort of understanding of how bad it really is or how bad it was. And I think you kind of see that in general, where globally we've gone through potentially amongst the best 30 years that the world has ever seen from the perspective of minimization of wars, minimization of famine, minimization of childhood disease, number of young children and girls going to school and getting educated globally. And so all those things have gotten dramatically better if you just look at all the metrics.
So you're taking this live from San Francisco. You do see an importance in sort of being in these physical hubs where people and innovation are taking place. And I think San Francisco or the Bay Area in general is definitely the number one version of that. I feel like the quality of life has been increasingly declining. Do you think it's getting so bad it might turn around soon, or what is it like being there right now?
Yeah, so I moved out of the city proper about a year ago. I'm still in the Bay Area. I think fundamentally, the city really has a lot of really poor policy choices that have dramatically impacted quality of life for many people who live in the city or who work in the city. And I think that COVID era policies really hurt the city in terms of some of the decisions were made and the focus on not reopening. I know a lot of companies are about to reopen and then things shut down, and I think that's going to really impact commercial real estate in the coming year because people never fully returned to the office in some sense when they could have, or they did more so in some other cities. And then obviously there's homelessness and crime and drug abuse and in the open and all sorts of other things that are really unfortunate. I'm not pessimistic in the short run and optimistic in the long run about the city. I think that to some extent AI has saved the city and or at least save tech in the city. And some members of the city council don't seem to actually want tech in the city, and so they're sort of antagonistic to it. But I do think that um, in the absence of AI, I knew a lot of founders who were leaving the Bay Area, and most of them were going to New York. And I felt like there was an exodus towards New York through much of last year, and then Stable Diffusion launched, and then a couple more months passed, and I'd still get emails from founders every couple of days saying they were leaving. And then suddenly there was this moment in, I don't remember what it was, August, September, October, where OpenAI kept launching more and more interesting things, culminating in ChatGPT. And then suddenly there's a reversal. And I feel like everybody's coming back now. And so, I don't remember who it was, but somebody's made the analogy that California more generally is kind of like one of those, how there's the curse of natural resources for countries.
Yeah.
where if you have too
You
many
don't have,
natural
yeah.
resources, you end up with bad governance and a bad, cronyism and all these things. And so, there's the argument being made that California to some extent has that in tech. And tech tax revenue is sort of like oil revenue for or a diamond mine or something. And I feel like AI is almost like discovering shale or something. You suddenly have this new resource and this new stream of technology and interestingness that's pulling everybody back in when perhaps the network effect would have dissipated.
A lot of my friends that left are moving back right now. So I think that's definitely true. San Francisco has definitely changed a lot in the last decade. I'm curious, like, since you made your first investment in venture in 2009, if so at all, how have you seen the venture ecosystem change?
Yeah, I mean it's a couple of things I think have shifted that are really important. The first is the actual size of the markets for technology have gotten massive. And that's in some sense reflected in market cap. If you look at the biggest companies in the world in 2009, I would guess, I don't have the data in front of me, it would be in somewhere in the low hundreds of billions. And that's for non-tech companies, right? Most tech companies were smaller than that. And the biggest companies in the world, if I remember correctly at the time, were probably things like maybe GE or Exxon or maybe a telecom or something. I mean, it's worth looking it up. And then now, if you look at the top market caps in the world, it's mainly tech companies, and you have trillion to $2 trillion market caps. Nvidia went from, I think it was probably worth a few billion in 2009, and it's now a $600 billion company, right? And so the scale of these things is massive, and the outcomes are bigger, I think, than anybody anticipated. And technology became such an important force in the broader global economy in a way that I don't think most people anticipated. And people talked about it, but I think the reality is much larger than anybody thought. And so that's created all sorts of changes in terms of the ecosystem, both in terms of the amount of capital that's available or funding for it, the degree to which different types of industries are being affected by technology, and the number of participants in the ecosystem, right? I mean, even over the last 2, 3 years, if you look at the number of people who have been added to big tech payrolls, despite the layoffs, right? Google went from 110,000 to almost 200,000 people over 2 years.
Wow.
Facebook went from 44,000 to 88,000. And so all these companies really expanded radically during COVID. And now that they're doing these layoffs, they actually haven't shrunk that much, right? Like even despite the layoffs at Facebook, they probably still not added, 20 or 30,000 people over the last 4 years.
Yeah, and I feel like the amount of new venture funds as well, like both sides of it have sort of exploded. How do you look at this market downturn versus the last one you went through? Do you think because technology, just the market has grown so much, it won't be as bad, or will next year be much worse? How are you thinking about it?
I think the last real tech market downturn was in 2001. And so a lot of people talk about the great financial crisis, but the reality is the great financial crisis didn't really impact tech very much. It was really financial services companies that were impacted. And I was running a startup at the time, and I got invited to the Sequoia Rest in Peace, Good Times presentation, where they said, okay, this era is over. And the era just kept going, right? And Sequoia actually did amazingly during the following 10 years. And so I think that one of the things that everybody in tech forgot was that there are cycles in tech and there are bad times. And we had 20 plus years of up and to the right where everything just worked, right? And so I think that's part of why there was the employee entitlement and why, all sorts of other things came up as issues. You could get distracted by politics at work instead of focusing on your customers. There's all sorts of side effects of only having good times. It's back to what we were saying in the global context, right? We had 30 years of
Yeah.
great times. And so maybe people didn't quite realize how good they had it. And I think that happened in tech. But to your point, Apple's not going away, Google's not going, like these companies are massive companies throwing off tons of cash. And so fundamentally, the technology industry is going to continue to be a fundamental piece of it. And in the startup ecosystem, there's still great startups being founded. So I think we're going to have a big correction and we're going to have a lot of cleanup over the next, 18, 24 months. But fundamentally, if you look at the very biggest companies, probably not that much really changes.
For recent grads, I do think it's sort of an awkward time. Some big tech companies are hiring a lot less, and I would say like, there's a chance a lot of startups will go under in the next year. Do you have any advice for like those initial jobs or those initial skills? Like where are the right places to be?
Yeah, I think the most important thing is to land at a company that's reasonably stable, that's still growing revenue, and doesn't have costs out of control, and has a good network or good market segment that it's focused on. And so often in your first job, the single most important thing is the thing growing really fast in a burn positive way, right? In a smart way. And is it a great network of people? And if those are the only two things you optimize for, you didn't optimize for job title or what you're actually doing or financial compensation or whatever, you'll end up probably having a great career. Because if a company grows really fast, and lots of roles change over time, then you can get all sorts of opportunities. You can actually switch functions. You get hired into biz ops or marketing, but you can suddenly become a PM or whatever it is that you want to do. Um, and then the network really matters, as we discussed earlier, right? And so I think people under optimize those two things and over optimize everything else. In today's environment, there aren't that many of those companies, but that's generically true. Usually there's only 5 or 7 of those companies at any given moment or any given year. And the mistake people made during the COVID era was to think that every company was one of those companies. And you saw that with
Yeah.
funding and with hiring and all these things.
Of those top tier companies, both ones that you've worked at, you've advised, or just, founders or CEOs you've met, is there a common thread that you've seen amongst those leaders?
A lot of it is product market fit. I think that a lot of it is just did people build something initially that lots of customers wanted, and is it a growing market? And then did the team make smart moves against that really strong product market fit and hire well and all the rest of it? And those are really hard things to do. So I don't mean to trivialize it, but if you
Yeah.
have an amazing team and terrible product market fit, you're going to get crushed. So it doesn't matter how good you are at operating if the market doesn't care.
That makes sense. You recently started a podcast, No Priors, which is amazing. I'll link it below. Everyone should listen to it. It has like all the best AI founders. A lot of funds have sort of upped their content, their creation in a way. I'm curious if this like personal brand building was always a part of venture as you saw it, or do you think this is a new phenomenon?
Yeah. So I'll answer the question, but I should also say I got kind of suckered into No Priors by Sarah because she pinged me and she said, "Hey, I'm doing this podcast and you want to do it with me?" And I said, "Oh, it sounds fun, but I don't have a lot of time." And she's like, "Oh, I'll do most of the work." And I said, "Okay, let's try it." And it ended up being a lot of work, and I'm happy we did it. But it was a little bit of that. I think if you look at the history of venture, or at least the more recent history, a lot of the biggest names have had content platforms. And so Fred Wilson would blog every day. Mark Andreessen had these amazing blogs before he started Andreessen Horowitz, and then Ben went and started and wrote 2 books, right? And if you look at a lot of the early people Andreessen Horowitz hired, it was people who had their own blogs and followership, like Chris Dixon and people like that, who were really smart investors, but also had this content platform. Mark Suster used to write a lot. You kind of go through and you saw people
That's
who ended up as big names because of their content platforms, and then some did it very purposefully. Like First Round launched, their efforts. Bill Gurley had Above the Crowd as an email newsletter in the 90s, right? And that was part of what established him as a name. And so, and you see this in the hedge fund world too. A lot of the big hedge fund names have these like newsletters they send out that everybody reads, or the Berkshire Hathaway letter. That's content marketing for Berkshire Hathaway.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, I think it's a very old concept.
Okay, got it. That's totally fair. Looking at scaling a company, you wrote High Growth Handbook. You've also worked at Twitter and Google in like very interesting periods of their early rise and rapid growth. When I look at the AI ecosystem, for example, today, I feel like the one sort of upper hand that startups may have is that if they can iterate really quickly, ship fast, stay super dynamic, when you're advising like growth stage companies or later stage companies, they've already found product market fit. How do you think about maintaining that super dynamic element to a later stage company and avoiding stagnation? I feel like that's sort of the trap that companies fall into.
Yeah, I think that's a great question, and it's a really hard one because I think that if you look at companies, there's a few patterns. Number one is companies that innovate early keep innovating, and the ones that innovate late never innovate again. And so, for example, eBay never had an Act Two, and PayPal never had an Act Two. And you just kind of go through the companies, and then there's the companies that innovated early, and whether those became successful revenue streams or not. Google did a ton of stuff really early, and then eventually, much later, they stagnated. Um, and I think there's 3 reasons for stagnation. Reason one is you have too much fragility or brittleness in the company, and that could either be product fragility, which was early Twitter with the fail whale, where people were scared to push code when I was there because it would break something
Mm.
and the site would go down, and so it really slowed down innovation. Or brittleness on the team. People were just constantly worried about being able to feed the core business, and they never built enough repeatability or strength around that, and so they didn't do other stuff. That's one reason. Second reason is regulatory action. Once regulators get involved, your company just stops innovating because you start passing everything through PR and comms and legal, and people who have no real place in terms of really driving whether something should launch or not. They should inform it, and they're really key stakeholders and really important. But you start to see more and more people in an organization who can say no. And that's not just, in PR and comms and legal, it's also in, you have 5 marketing teams that need to weigh in, and you have 5 design teams that need to weigh in, and everybody's default is no. And so, part of it is as an organization scales, you have that. Third is who you hire as your company successful shifts. Risk averse people are going to show up when your company is successful, not at the beginning of your company, because when your company is not successful, it's risky and they don't want to show up. And so you have this shift where the people may be equally good, they're very smart and capable, but suddenly all the risk averse people show up and all the risk seeking people leave. And so you have a shift in the mix of people and the culture. And then lastly, as a public company, for example, once you go public, your board is going to be much more focused on compliance than strategy in some cases. And so that slows you down. Or you may be focused on margin structure over innovation. And so there's also certain aspects of being a public company that impacts your ability to innovate, unless you take a very strong stance on we're just going to innovate, which some companies do. So there's like 4 or 5 factors, and I don't think it's like one single thing, and it
Yeah.
depends on the mix per company. Um, but I do think there's this really odd thing where if you don't launch a second product within the first few 10 millions of revenue, you tend never to launch a second product that's meaningful. And I don't know why that is, but it seems like a very clear pattern.
That's really interesting. You worked at Google and Twitter. Twitter probably could have been bigger than it is today. Looking at what Elon's done with it so far, like how do you think about it having seen that company on the inside?
Yeah, I think that the interesting thing about Twitter is that the product changes that are kind of obvious to make on it were obvious 13, 14 years ago when I first got bought into there, when my company got acquired into Twitter, right? And so the ideas were clear in terms of what to do. It just many things never got executed. Like, why didn't you have long form content, and why didn't you have editable tweets, and why didn't we had all these designs, and there's 30 ways to do it, and they all could work. And there was other sort of missed opportunities around video and all sorts of other things. And so it's a company that unfortunately just there's a lot of opportunities that kind of went by it. And, part of it seems to be that before Musk came in, there's a very strong culture of political activism and orientation. And sometimes that distracts a company. I think there was just some early brittleness that maybe carried through. I'm not sure. I mean, it's hard for me to really say anything past when I was there, right? Which was
Yeah.
a decade ago. So I have no idea what the internal machinations were. I do think the company, like many technology companies, probably was much bigger than it should have been people wise.
Mm.
But, there was a lot of obvious things to build that just never got built for some reason.
Elon seems to be going after Substack, traditional media. He has an ambitious vision there. Obviously, I think the topic of AI regulation has become very prevalent over the past few months. And last week, Sam Altman was at the White House. How do you think AI should be regulated right now?
Yeah, I feel like there's maybe 3 or 4 different things that get conflated or mixed when people talk about AI safety and therefore the need for regulation. I think, one of them is the AI biased, against specific people or demographics. The second is, does it spread misinformation or hate content? Third is, will somebody use the AI to do something malicious? And malicious could mean a financial phishing attack. It could mean derailing a train. And then fourth is, will the AI itself become a threat to us, like as a species? Is there an existential moment where AI tries to kill us all or something, right? And those are sort of the 4 different buckets. And there may be others, right? There's maybe a fifth one, which is more about global competition with China or other countries in terms of defense and defense capabilities, right? And so, when people talk about those things, they mix all these things together.
Yeah.
And then when they talk about regulation, they're kind of like, AI will kill us someday, so let's regulate it. But somebody else is talking about, hey, I'm worried about misinformation or something, right? Um, and I think it's really important to be clear about what are you actually worried about on what time frame, and then based on that, how do you think about regulation? I think about regulation today in two ways, or maybe three ways, as I think about those different areas of threat. One is I do think from a national defense perspective, it's important for us to not stymie these things too much, but more importantly than defense perhaps is, or equally importantly, is all the very positive ramifications of AI in terms of think of equity in healthcare and how you could potentially provide Stanford level care to anybody in the world or anybody in the US, right? Where it's not accessible right now due to cost, or anybody could have access to great legal resources if they need to defend themselves or deal with a contract issue or a house issue or whatever it is. Or think about the education potential where every kid, no matter how poor or where they are in the world, should have some AI agent that's helping customize learning for them and help them, right? So there are
Yeah.
these huge potential benefits. And so my concern about knee-jerk regulation is, well, you may really stymie all those benefits and you end up, a lot of the decisions it feels like in society right now are made purely on a safety vector without any thinking of what's the benefit of this thing. There's no cost benefit. It's just
Yeah,
cost.
and there's been a risk with every new wave of technology, right? But I don't think that's like what we think about now in retrospect. We think about how much it's amplified our opportunities.
Yeah, totally. And if you look at and I think there are certain things I'd regulate, like export controls of advanced chips, things like that. I would say, okay, we already have export controls. Let's ensure that those still exist for certain types of technologies that we don't want to spread for different reasons. But to your point, if you look at the history of the 20th century, we had two world wars, we had genocides or attempted genocides on multiple occasions. We had mass scale famine on in multiple contexts, including the Great Leap Forward. And that had nothing to do with technology. That was just people acting really badly.
Yeah.
And so I think people kind of forgot that. It's back to like we've had times that are too good, and so we're like, oh no, the thing may say something mean to me on social media, and you're like, well,
Yeah.
that's really bad, but there's worse
Yeah.
things.
There's much worse things. If you think about the probability that AGI is a near reality, what excites you about it? And then what is that sort of very risky scenario?
Yeah, I mean, the optimistic view is AI becomes this fantastic tool slash complementary thing that really helps drive science forward and society forward and creates large scale global equity around education and healthcare and all these really important areas. And it helps augment people and make them more productive and all the rest, right? So the positive scenario is that there's two different versions of the negative scenario. One version of the negative scenario is people have nothing to do because AI becomes better than people at everything. And often people say, well, what about creativity? And we'll always be more creative and all this stuff. And if you look at gaming as an example, every time we had AIs compete at games, we always said, well, it won't be better at the next thing, right? And so we had it play chess better than us with like, I don't know what it was called, Deep Blue or Blue Mind or some IBM thing,
Yeah.
right? In the 90s. And it beat people at chess, and people are like, okay, it'll never beat us at Go. Go's too complicated. And then it beat us at Go. And then we're like, well, it'll never beat us at poker. It can't bullshit better than a person. And then it beat us at poker. And I said, well, diplomacy. It'll never beat us at diplomacy because, then you have to manipulate people. And then it beats us at diplomacy. So every time we've set a task, it's done better. One risk is just there's nothing for people to do. And maybe for 80% of people, that's great, right? Everybody just wants to play, games on their computer or interact with a digital companion or something. But I'm guessing there's 10 or 20% of society that will be very dissatisfied. And then what happens, right? And then there's
Yeah.
the other type of risk, which is does AI compete with humanity as a species, as a new digital life form? And I feel like there's two prerequisites to that becoming a strong version of that. One is you need the AI to be able to evolve and replicate. And people are already, if you look at GitHub Copilot, for example, the claim is that for the code repositories that it's associated with, it writes 40% of the code. And people are actively working on AI models that will build the next model themselves. They'll write their own code. And so eventually you should have a dynamic ecosystem of AIs that are replicating, writing their own code, and making themselves sequentially better, faster and faster. Imagine if you could make 100 virtual copies of you, Sabrina, and they made their own better copies and you were better, faster, stronger each generation. You would take over
Yeah.
the world very rapidly, right? In terms of just capabilities. And so imagine if an AI could do that. Now the argument against that is, well, you could always turn it off, right? You just go to the data center and turn it off and no big deal. And I think that's largely true. And so then the question is, well, what if you start replacing what humans do in the physical world, right? Because right now you need a person to literally go in the data center and swap out the GPU that's been burnt out just through time, right?
Yeah. Or build the data
And
center.
or build the data center, yeah. And so I think there's going to be incredibly strong economic drivers for that, right? We'll say, well, isn't this amazing? This robot can build low income housing for everybody, and isn't it great? This robot can build data centers, and it can build solar farms, and it can build all these things for humanity, so we can just focus on creative work.
Yeah.
Um, and at that point, I think we've sort of crossed a Rubicon where you can't really turn it off anymore because it now has a physical form. And then you have true species competition because eventually you hit a point where you're like, oh, like who gets the rights to this lithium mine that was just discovered? Or hey, should we use this land to build a city or a bunch of data centers for the AI, right? And so then you start competing for resources. And so the very grim scenario would be some future where there's like species competition with a series of AIs.
When you think about these motivations around current incumbents to regulate, what are some of those motivations?
Yeah, I mean, I think in general, whenever you have regulation in an industry, it tends to favor the incumbents, right? Like startups are usually penalized by regulation because it adds extra bar and craft and team and cost and time frames and everything else. It makes everything take longer and be harder. And so that favors existing companies that already have distribution and have regulatory relationships and have products on the market. And if you suddenly said, hey, anybody else who launches a product like mine needs to go register it and spend a year on it, or 2 years, or 5 years, or whatever it is, that really slows down innovation for anybody that's small. And
Yeah.
that's biotech, right? The cost for a drug is now at $1.5 billion to develop and sell a drug, and a lot of that is regulatorily driven, and it's back to cost benefit. And if you think about drug development as an example, there are periods of time where we relax regulation and we haven't seen large scale terrible things happen to people. We've just seen much faster drug development. That happened during COVID.
Yeah.
We said, hey, there's an emergency, and suddenly we had vaccines in 9 months and we had multiple drugs in 9 months. Or this actually happened during World War II with Winston Churchill, where he wanted something to treat gonorrhea in soldiers in the field. And so he said, hey, let's find something and we'll get rid of anything that gets in the way regulatorily. And so they rediscovered and developed penicillin in under a year. In general, regulation is very good for incumbents and very bad for everybody else if you just want to lock in power structures.
I look at biotech. Obviously, you started a healthcare company, so you've seen this firsthand. But I think it's obviously really important to have a high bar for regulation. But I also do think like really smart founders recognize just like how hard it is to build, or you have to so perfectly fit around regulation or insurance models or whatever it is that it really ends up limiting like what issues people actually go after. And I think that's a bummer.
Yeah, I think
But
people really need to think in terms of cost benefit. And if you take a cost benefit framework, you can ask what's the real risk here and what's the real reward, and therefore I can make trade offs. And it should be a spectrum versus we should turn something off or on. The last thing I'll say in regulation relative to AI really quickly is I think one of the moments that may catalyze the regulation of AI is this coming presidential election, because this is going to be the first AI election. And if you look at the things that are happening now in voice, if you look at the things that are happening now in content generation and targeting and all these things, they'll definitely be used as tools. Whether they matter or impact the election or not is probably separable from whether or not a party will then say, hey, we should really regulate this thing because it impacted the election. It's sort of like the claims I've heard now is that if you actually look at the underlying data, Cambridge Analytica didn't really move the needle on the election when Trump won, but it was a great excuse to go after all the social networking companies, right? And they
yeah,
became broadly reviled by both sides, right? The right hated them and the left hated them for different reasons. And it's possible AI falls into that same trap in a presidential election. And maybe there's like a 1 in 3 chance if that's the case, but I think that's the moment where regulation could
Jeff,
take off.
looking at the AI ecosystem today, everyone's really excited about the AI wave. I think people are seeing sort of the results of research that's been going on for years and years for the first time, and consumer products are really tangible and it's really exciting. And I think from an investment perspective, it's kind of confusing actually because there's so much popping up and there's sort of this like underlying understanding that a lot of these companies might not actually make it, whether they get taken by incumbents or there's just too much competition. How do you think about picking the winners in the AI world right now?
Yeah, I think it's really hard because there's things that will clearly happen, but you don't know who will make them happen. And then there's the things that you never would have expected to suddenly take off, right? And there's
Yeah.
multiple companies now that have gotten to real scale in terms of either revenue or usage, right? There's Midjourney and GitHub Copilot and Jasper and a variety of other things that actually seem to be working quite well. If you look at, and then obviously a lot of incumbents are adopting it. And if you look at the history of technology waves, you tend to have this differential split between what portion of value in a market as a technology shift happens goes to incumbents versus startups. And so the first internet wave was probably 80% startup value. And you saw incumbents really get demolished, right? Like Amazon destroyed lots of local stores and local bookstores. Walmart had done the same thing, by the way, a few decades earlier, right? And then, Netflix and eventually Disney and others really changed the nature of content, and the whole DVD industry got disrupted, all the blockbusters and stuff. And then you had mobile come along, and mobile was kind of the opposite in terms of 80/20 incumbent to startup, right? There weren't that many startups that were created from the ground up for mobile, right? It was Instacart and DoorDash and Instagram, and it was a lot of value and great companies and important use cases, but it wasn't at the same scale of the internet, but it was still very important. Part of the reason it wasn't at the same scale of the internet is a lot of um, the incumbents just added a mobile website, right? So search on your phone was still Google, and you didn't change which airline you used. You just go to a mobile app instead of going to the website. And AI feels to me like it's somewhere in between. It seems like there's going to be a handful of existing industries that will be completely turned over in a way that hasn't really happened since the internet. But then there will also be lots and lots of incumbents who are going to adopt it and be fine, right? And they'll continue to thrive. And so part of the question is, what is the change in use case and capabilities? And how does that play against the set of assets you have as an incumbent? And therefore, how disruptible are you? And I think you need to think through that lens. How important is the distribution you already have? How important is the existing product or workflow? How important, like you make the list of
Yeah.
what is an incumbent asset, and then you map it against the degree to which it's disrupted by AI. And then you can come to some conclusion in terms of whether you think that industry will get changed or not.
And then if you look at like that same lens, but actually rather than from the incumbent perspective, but I guess from the startup perspective, development is getting quicker because you have tools like Copilot, and startup moats are getting harder for most of these application layer companies. Are you focused on defensibility right now as you're investing?
I think the most important thing to me is rapidity of go-to-market adoption, because I think the defensibility tends to get built later for most types of companies, unless they're very either tech driven or IP driven, and that's true of SaaS. Like much of SaaS doesn't have defensibility early, it gets it later in the life of the company, right? And so often you see three people working for 6 months and they launch something and it really takes off, and somehow they remain the incumbent forever in that category. But catching up to three people working on something for 6 months should be really easy to do, right? Um, and so then you ask, okay, is it because they built moats? Is it because other founders are too proud to copy? The other piece of it is usually early on in the life of a company, your competitors or other startups. But then 4 or 5 years later, an incumbent wakes up and goes after you because suddenly it's
It
big enough to
becomes
be important.
Microsoft.
Yeah,
Or
Microsoft wakes
Microsoft.
up, right? Um, and so I think there's also differences between who you compete with, and usually other startups don't want to just copy or clone you. There's too much sort of pride of ownership, perhaps. But what was defensible early on about Notion, or what was defensible early
Yeah.
on about XS company, and then it becomes very defensible over time.
Yeah. And then on the large model level, any thoughts about sort of how it'll end up shaking up between like OpenAI, Google, Meta?
I have a hypothesis, it's probably incorrect, that we'll probably end up with like a split or bifurcated market where there'll be, at least for the next few years, I'm not saying forever, for the next few years, there'll be a handful of players with extremely advanced models. They'll be far ahead of open source and other players. And my assumption is there'll be three or four of them. And I think OpenAI will be one, and Google will be one, and there'll be a couple others. And then I think there'll be like a second tier of companies in terms of capabilities, and then I think there'll be a bunch of open source.
Mm.
And I think the open source providers, in the short run at least, will be a generation or two behind the most advanced proprietary models. But that may still be extremely valuable, right? So for example, when we're at GPT-6, there will be open source equivalents of GPT-5 and 4, perhaps, right? And so that means that um, what are the really advanced capabilities that you need and who's going to be providing them? And then what's like a step behind that? And then relatedly, if you look at it, every cloud provider now has an integration with a LLM model, and Amazon is actually the one that's lacking it. And so I'm kind of one of the other things I wonder is if you look at the history of software, often the open source models are backed by somebody who has an incentive to back them. So, for example,
Hmm.
IBM was the main backer of Linux in the 90s, and they funded much of the development of Linux. It's very under discussed. Um, and so, who is going to be that for open source LLMs? Because if you assume that the cost keeps going up to train each subsequent generation of LLMs because of the compute you need, then maybe Amazon becomes that backer, maybe Facebook becomes that backer. It's unclear to me, right? Somebody probably
Yeah.
will emerge as that. And the one other thing I'll note is I think somebody told me that the cost of training the models drops by, I can't remember the number exactly, it's 1.4x every year or something. And so GPT-3 originally cost 10 million to train. Now you could do it probably for somewhere between $500,000 and $1 million to do it from scratch. And so that's why I think open source will always
Catch
catch
up
up. It's because the
eventually.
cost will keep dropping. Yeah.
Very interesting perspectives on that.
But
I
that
think
could be
it's
wrong.
exciting
Yeah.
too.
That,
No, no, no.
I give it like,
I think that makes
a
sense.
50-50 chance. I don't know, but I really think it could be wrong, right? It's possible that, it turns out that, there's all these sort of mix of expert models and things like that, where, like GPT-4 is like that, right? You're just kind of assembling a bunch of sub modules that are effective at different things with some, plane on top of it. Um, and so, maybe you just aggregate a bunch of small models and then you have some control system. There's also things that may
Yeah.
happen, but in general, all of deep learning suggests that scale really helps. So I
Yeah.
think the most likely scenario is what I described. But
Getting more personal for a second, I think people probably know you as an investor, an advisor, a founder. Looking at sort of your career up to date, like what has been the biggest setback you faced, and what have you learned from it?
no, it's a good question. I don't know what the single biggest setback was. I think, when I moved out to Silicon Valley, it was right as the dot-com wave was collapsing. And so I joined a startup at 120 people, it grew to 160, and then it shrank to 12 or 13 people over 5 rounds of layoffs. And I got laid off in the third round when it shrank to like 50 people or so 50, 60, something like that. And I had no money. I had a bunch of school debt, I was sleeping on the floor. I didn't have a bed, and the main question was in my mind was like, how do I stay in Silicon Valley? Because I really wanted to stay and work on tech, but there was no jobs. And so I just started pinging startups and offering to work for free. And so I worked for two companies for free. And then one company paid me, and I think they overpaid me. And that gave me enough money to stick around for a couple months longer. And so I just kind of like living a bit month to month in terms of trying to
Yeah.
survive. Um,
At that point, was the alternative sort of taking a more traditional path, like consulting, finance, something like that?
in that first set of moments, I tried to apply for a bunch of technology jobs. Nobody would hire me. And then I tried to apply for kind of tech adjacent jobs, and they were all going away because, the whole .com and tech industry was collapsing. And especially as somebody who's straight out of school, there just wasn't any roles.
Yeah.
So I ended up eventually actually joining McKinsey for a year, and that paid off like all my debt. It was a really great place to land and reset. And then I joined Google after that. But yeah, I think it was a close one. There's a reasonable set of paths on which I just would never have been able to stay in technology.
Well, we're all happy you did. Which lesson do you think has taken you the longest to learn?
That's a good question. I don't know. I think there's a lot of stuff you accumulate over time. I was actually thinking of I started writing I don't know if a book is probably overstating it, but I thought it'd be really neat to write like life lessons for my kids. Like, here's all the stuff I've learned.
Yeah.
And if I tell it to you directly after you're a teenager or something, you just won't listen to me. And so how do I put it in a format where maybe you'll think some of this stuff is like interesting? And so, I think there's all sorts of takeaways that you sort of accumulate over time in terms of people and their motivations and
Mhm.
who's actually a good person versus a bad person, and what does that mean? And how should you think about your career? And how should you think about relationships and all these other things? And so it's, so I thought, at some point it may be interesting to try and pull something like that together.
I think you should. One thing I've been observing recently is that I feel like a lot of really intelligent, intentional people don't really share insights about those types of things in life. And it's like they kind of just share insights on like these career focused observations. And then you have like influencers, which are great too, but they're the ones giving you like love advice and life advice and all these things. And I would be I think Paul Graham has written a couple essays around this, but I would be super interested to hear more like thoughts around like how to choose a life partner from like a really thoughtful, smart person. So I hope you sort of release those, or maybe they'll get but beyond the confines of your household. That would be cool. Okay,
Yeah, I
I
think people
just
are all scared to write about those things
yeah,
for a
definitely.
variety of reasons.
Yeah, that's true. In our last 5 minutes, I just want to ask you some like lightning questions quickly. First, why did you pick Goku from Dragon Ball as your avatar?
Wow. I started using that avatar a long time ago before people had, I think, like pseudonymous avatars or whatever you want to call it. And I like anime a lot. I thought it was representative of, a character who both I think I really enjoyed when I was growing up, like watching, but also who was an interesting mixture of like lighthearted, well-intentioned, and could be really tough and like, do hard things or whatever.
What's one thing that you've changed your mind on in the last 5 years?
Uh, Probably on the relative rationality and good intentions of most institutions.
Mm. How has it changed?
For the negative,
The more you know, yeah. Um, any advice you could offer on how to manage one's time? I think time management is like something that people don't think about a lot, but it ends up amounting really to your life in many ways.
yeah, I think it changes. I think early in your career, you're rewarded for saying yes to everything, and everything is an overstatement, right? There's stupid things that you can do. Like I always tended to avoid like the boondoggle conference circuit or things like that, right?
Mm.
Early in your career, saying yes tends to be useful. Yes, I'll take on the extra project. Yes, I'll talk to your friend who's looking for a job in tech. Yes, I'll help XYZ with whatever, right? And then later in your life, that really catches up to you and penalizes you because everybody wants your help on something and you should say no to most things. And so I think one of the big transitions people have to go through in their life is going from one mindset to the other, where that initial mindset was the thing that actually made them successful in some cases. But it's no longer, it's now the thing that's going to really hurt them.
Mm.
And I think there's a number of things in life like that where at different stages, it's back to that broader question of like, how do different aspects of your life evolve over time? And I think people need to think of everything as an evolutionary versus static process and ask themselves, what are the things that I care about at my core from a static perspective versus what do I want to continue to evolve?
Yeah.
And so, how do I stay true to a very small number of things and let everything else change? And you see that at the company level, right? If you look at companies, people often get stuck on culture not changing. They're like, we can't change our culture, And you're like, well, everything has changed about your company. Your team has changed, your product has changed, your complexity has changed, the market's like everything's changed. Why would you not change your culture? Right. And I feel like there's the personal version of that as well. Like, what are the things that you should be tweaking sequentially?
Last question is what is something that makes you very optimistic for the future?
I think many things make me very optimistic for the future. I think that fundamentally, again, I think there's a lot of really bad things happening in the world, and there's a lot of very tough lives, but people need to remember that globally, we're doing dramatically better than we've ever done on so many metrics. And there's so much positive things that people could do if they wanted to, and so many ways that technology or other tools could help. Even, simple policy tools, right? Let's put technology aside. Just changing certain policies could have such massive impact on humanity. Um, and so it's really worth thinking through, like, are you going to focus on your political affiliation or pseudo religious beliefs? Or are you going to actually try and help people?
Yeah.
And if you actually try and help people, what does that mean in terms of the sets of things that should change societally? And how can you help encourage those changes?
Yeah. I think media right now is like hyper focused on I think it spends too much time sort of trying to take down people who have like at least their core intention is to help people, versus there's a lot of people that aren't particularly involved. They don't spend a lot of their willpower trying to actually make like any difference beyond the confines of their life. Anyway, Elad, thank you so much for coming on Tomorrow Talk. I will link all your socials below. I love no priors, so I'm happy you did it, and I also really enjoy your blogs, your Substack. Thank you so much.
Oh, thanks so much for including me. It was a lot of fun.